Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming to this virtual presentation about Dr. Mary Walker's Civil War. I've been working on this project for 2 or 3 years now, and one of the things that attracted me to it was the ability to link two of my favorite topics together, and those are the history of women in wartime and the women's suffrage movement. And what I want to do today to just kind of introduce everybody to Mary Walker, who she was and what she did, is to show how those two things do link up in her life to the point that they're so intertwined that Mary Walker's beliefs about women's rights and suffrage really made it possible for her to do the kind of work that she did during the Civil War. So what I'm going to do is just to take you through the chronological events, and the emphasis will be on her Civil War activities. I do want to talk a little bit near the end about her contributions to the suffrage movement and how that all works together. So basically, Mary Edwards Walker, born in 1832 in Oswego, New York, kind of upstate, rural farming community that was nevertheless extremely vibrant throughout most of the decades of the 19th century in terms of reformist and even radical activity. And when we see this photograph of Mary Walker as a young woman, we can already get a sense of exactly how she came to embody those radical beliefs from the 19th century. And of course, what we see her here wearing is not the standard 19th century attire of a middle-class white woman. She's wearing trousers. And that was a big deal for women in especially the middle portion of the 19th century. And it really reflects her raising by her parents, Alva and Vesta Walker, who were certainly reformists. They were also described as sometimes as radicals, sometimes as free thinkers, but they did embrace reforms including temperance, coeducation for boys and girls. They also very much supported the abolitionist movement, which was, of course, one of the big reforms in the North in the decades prior to the Civil War. And the Walker household in Oswego was reportedly a stop on the Underground Railroad. And added to all of this, the Walkers did believe in gender equality. They believed that a person's interests and abilities should be the things that guided them through their choices in life, and that people should not be prevented from doing something simply because they were a man or a woman. And as a child and as a young woman, Mary Walker took all of this to heart. She very much believed in these teachings by her parents and by others. Notable abolitionist speakers came to Oswego before the Civil War, including Frederick Douglass. There's no evidence that Mary Walker actually met Douglass at that point, but it's not unlikely that she and her parents were in the audience when he came to speak. So she learned about these things, she believed in them, she adapted them to her own life, and as kind of an outward manifestation of that, by the early 1850s, she started wearing what was known as the bloomer costume, which was a pair of trousers worn under a skirt or a dress. And for the rest of her adult life, this was the outfit that Mary Walker wore both in public and in private. And it did very much provide that outward signal about her radical beliefs, especially about women's rights and gender equality. Her beliefs about equality and women's rights led her to attend medical school. In 1853, she was able to join a class at the Syracuse Medical College, also in New York. This is not actually a picture of that particular college, but it's a similar one from upstate New York in the same time period. And like many people who attended a formal medical school in the 19th century, especially in the first half, Mary Walker attended for 2 years. It was a combination of coursework and practical application, being out with a doctor, going to visit patients, working in hospitals. So she had that practical application during her schooling as well. She was one of very few women who were in medical school at the time. Syracuse Medical College was unique in that it did allow women to enroll and to take classes on an equal basis with men. And when she graduated in 1855, she did graduate with honors. She was certified by the medical college, which entitled her to practice as a physician and as a surgeon. Later on in 1855, she married one of her fellow students, a doctor by the name of Albert Miller. They seemed to be very compatible, both in terms of their work and their life philosophies. Miller was reportedly a very strong reformist, even some would say a radical in his beliefs. Their wedding in 1855 was presided over by the Reverend Samuel May, and the May name was pretty big in the Northeast at the time. Samuel May was an uncle of the author Louisa May Alcott, and was also very prominent in reform circles, especially abolition and women's rights. And both Albert Miller and Mary Walker had requested that the word obey be taken out of their marriage vows. And as usual, Mary Walker wore her bloomer costume as her wedding outfit. So it did seem that this was a perfect marriage, but in reality, it was not. Within a few years, Mary Walker found out that her husband had been repeatedly unfaithful, and he tried to work that out by telling his wife he would be fine if she wanted to do the same thing, and they could have what I guess we would refer to today as an open marriage. Mary Walker declined. She did have rather traditional views about marriage, but they did not prevent her from securing a divorce from Albert Miller. So her intent on securing divorce kind of consumed those last years of the 1850s as the United States was breaking apart because of the sectionalism over the spread of slavery. And she finally did get New York State to grant her the divorce in 1861. And as soon as that legal effort was taken care of, Mary Walker decided she was going to make the biggest contribution she could think of to bring about the goals of the abolitionist movement in freeing enslaved people. And for her, that was becoming a part of the Civil War effort. And in the fall of 1861, she packed up her medical practice in New York, and she came to Washington, D.C., and she went straight away to the office of the Secretary of War, who at the time was Simon Cameron. And she presented herself to him, and I guess we can all kind of imagine his surprise that not only was a woman asking for an appointment, but when she showed up in his office, here was a woman in her late 20s wearing trousers, claiming to be a medical doctor, and not only asking to be part of the Civil War effort, but also asking him for a commission in the Army. She wanted to be a member of the United States military. She understood that the military needed trained medical doctors, and she certainly considered herself one of them. She had her medical school certificate. She had practiced medicine for several years at this point. So, except for her gender, she was the kind of person that the United States Army really needed. Her skills were needed, but the fact that she was a woman made Simon Cameron emphatically turn her down. He told her there was no precedent for a woman being commissioned into the Army. He really didn't see the need for him to make an exception in her case, and he essentially sent her on her way. And for Mary Walker, she didn't like to be told no about much of anything. She always had a very firm sense of herself, what was right and what was wrong. And she very much believed that Cameron was simply wrong in dismissing her because she was a woman. And instead of leaving Washington, instead of just deciding, well, she would go back to New York and see what she could do from there, she stayed in Washington, and she started simply going around to the various military hospitals that had been established in the capital city, and she was offering up her services. And just as she experienced with Simon Cameron, she found that most of these hospitals that she inquired at, she was turned away. They were run by male doctors, and as a female physician, because of her gender, she encountered a lot of resistance from most male doctors who simply did not believe that women were qualified to be physicians, especially not with the military. It was one thing if a female doctor was going to be treating women and children. It was entirely different if they expected to be treating soldiers. So she found herself turned away from most of these military hospitals, even though they were still very much in need of trained medical professionals. Some did say, well, if she wanted to work as a nurse, she could come on board as a nurse. She refused. She said she was not a nurse, she was a doctor, and that's how she would work. She finally did have some luck when she visited what was known as the Indiana Hospital, which had been set up in the old, well, I guess at the time it wasn't so old, but the Patent Office building had been repurposed, as many public buildings in Washington were during the war, and it had already been occupied by some soldiers from Rhode Island. When they moved out, there was a contingent of Indiana soldiers who moved in. They brought with them their medical personnel, and they established a hospital there that they referred to then as the Indiana Hospital. And when Mary Walker showed up, the surgeon in charge of the 19th Indiana Volunteers, a man by the name of Dr. Green, had just lost one of his assistant surgeons, and he was very much overwhelmed, mostly by soldiers who had suffered some wounds. There was a lot of illness running through various encampments. He was simply overwhelmed, and he had no problem with the fact that Mary Walker was a woman. And he said it was fine with him if she wanted to work at the hospital. He would help, he would try to find somebody with the Surgeon General's office, who might make allowances for the fact she was a woman, and to see if there was some way of, after all, securing a commission, even though the Secretary of War said no. So Dr. Green was willing not only to give her a job, but to intercede on her behalf with the military establishment. But he also had no luck with that. As much as he was willing for her to have a commission, the military establishment would not budge on that. At one point, he offered to pay Mary Walker out of his own salary. He said, you know, I'm happy to share this with you. She declined. She said she understood he had family obligations. She wasn't going to take money from him. So essentially, for the first years of her service to the United States military, this was voluntary service. She was donating her military expertise. She did have at least one encounter with a woman who is very much associated with Civil War medicine, and that was Dorothea Dix, who the United States Army did hire on as the superintendent of the Army nurses. And Dorothea Dix had no medical training herself. By the start of the Civil War, she was known, she had a great reputation as a reformer. She had done quite a bit to clean up what were known as asylums in the 19th century. Patients who had mental illnesses were often locked away under horrible conditions. Dorothea Dix helped to clean up a lot of that in terms of hospital care. And she had this job then during the Civil War to coordinate hiring women who would serve as nurses with the military, but not as members of the military. And at least once, Dorothea Dix came to the Indiana hospital. She saw Dr. Mary Walker at work. She may have been impressed with Walker's medical knowledge. She was not happy, though, to see a woman working as a physician. She did not approve. And Mary Walker took great exception to the way that Dix treated the nurses who were working at the Indiana hospital, and the way that she was treated herself there by Dorothea Dix. And by 1862, Mary Walker started moving out from the confines of Washington, D.C. itself. By 1862, she was in the field as a surgeon. She was not what we would call a battlefield surgeon. She was not there during active battles. She tended to come to facilities that were set up just behind the lines, usually just as or right after a battle was ending, and she would provide medical care there. In late 1862, for example, she was in Falmouth, Virginia, at a place called Lacy House, and she was tending to the soldiers that had been injured and become ill during, most of them were under the command of General Ambrose Burnside. And she was known to the general. He did think much of her medical capabilities. He was certainly willing to have her there as a doctor treating his men. While she was there, she also very likely ran into a couple of other big names from Civil War medicine. Clara Barton was also there in late December of 1862, also at Lacy House. I've checked the stories about each of these women, where they were at specific times, and it's almost impossible that they didn't at least pass each other at some point and see what each other was doing in terms of medical care. Walt Whitman, this is also where the poet Walt Whitman came look for his brother, who had been first reported killed, then reported injured in a battle. Whitman found that his brother had survived, and what he saw there at Lacy House inspired Whitman to spend most of the rest of the Civil War also working as a nurse to try and help sick and injured soldiers. Mary Walker continued in 1862 and into part of 1863, moving between the field and medical work in Washington, D.C. And during 1863, she did move on to a more Western location. And she ends up in Tennessee in 1863. And here, at the end of the battle at Chickamauga, as Union forces were moving into Chattanooga, she gets a job with a military hospital in Chattanooga. And that's where she encounters General George Thomas, who really thought very highly of her medical skills. He was at the time commanding the Army of the Cumberland, and this, of course, gave Mary Walker a very powerful military ally. And she understood that the more she did well in the eyes of these commanding officers, the better the chance she stood of actually getting what she wanted. And still in 1863, what she wanted most of all was a commission. She never gave up on that. And almost every person associated with the military that she encountered, she asked about getting a commission. She also did at one point send a letter to President Abraham Lincoln asking him to intervene on her behalf and secure a military commission. Lincoln did reply to her. He actually took the time to send her a letter saying he very much appreciated her service to the U.S. Army, but he was not going to intervene in military matters on her behalf. But if the military wanted to commission her, Lincoln was more than willing to support them in that endeavor. And it was with her cordial relationship with General Thomas that Mary Walker came as close to getting what she wanted from the military. And rather than a commission, General Thomas offered her a contract as a civilian military surgeon, that she could be on the payroll as a civilian employee of the United States Army, and employed specifically as a doctor. Thomas got this idea and was willing to make her this offer in early 1864 when he was informed that a group from Ohio was suddenly without its surgeon, and he decided that Mary Walker would be the perfect person to put in this position. But before she could get that employment contract, Mary Walker had to undergo a medical board examination. And this was absolutely standard procedure for all of the civilian doctors that would be awarded these kinds of similar contracts. So she was not singled out for this simply because she was a woman, but the medical board that examined her was very much aware of the fact that she was a woman. And everybody involved with that medical board examination was, from the start, unwilling to see a female physician get this kind of medical contract. So this photograph that I found of Dr. Glover Perrin, we see him sitting there in the middle. This was actually taken several years after 1864, but it's the only one of him that I can find. He was at the time serving as the medical director for the Army of the Cumberland. He organized Mary Walker's medical board examination. He did not actually sit on the board itself while they were examining Dr. Walker, but he was the person who set this all up. And it was another doctor who would shortly succeed Perrin as medical director who oversaw the actual examination, which was took place in several parts. There was a written component. There was actual on-scene care for soldiers. Mary Walker was observed taking care of patients, and then she had to sit and answer a series of questions. And in the aftermath of this medical board examination, the board sent its findings to General Thomas and informed him that Mary Walker had done so poorly with the exam that they would rate her medical knowledge on par with any female nurse, or in fact, any woman who just took care of her own family members on a regular basis. They were not willing to credit her with any kind of specialized medical knowledge. And so they recommended that General Thomas not give her this contract as a surgeon. Mary Walker knew that these doctors did not like the way she performed at the exam. She went right back to General Thomas in person and gave him her version of the events of how she was treated. He apparently believed her. Over this male medical staff, despite this negative opinion, General Thomas then ordered Mary Walker to proceed to northern Georgia, where the 52nd Ohio Volunteers were encamped. They were at a place called Lee and Gordon's Mills in northern Georgia. This was territory very nominally occupied by the United States Army. It was difficult territory. And one of the reasons why General Thomas was willing to give Mary Walker this contract was that she was also willing to gather intelligence for the United States Army while she was working as a doctor there. With the 52nd Ohio, she not only treated the men who were still in the hospital there, but she was encouraged to go out among the civilian population and to treat people who actually hadn't had access to medical care for many years at that point. And she was fairly welcome as a doctor in this area. She did treat a lot of patients. And as she was out in the countryside, sometimes traveling alone, sometimes traveling with Union soldiers as her escorts, she was essentially in Confederate territory. And she knew every time she went out that she was at risk of being captured, or worse. She also, as a woman, she understood that she was at risk for physical assault and rape, but nevertheless, she went out and she carried out these medical duties. She gathered as much intelligence about Confederate troop movements. This was at the time when Sherman was planning his march to the sea. The Union Army just wanted as much information as it could get about anything that was happening in Southern territory at the time. And Mary Walker was willing to do that. And her luck held out only for a few weeks. By April, one of her worst fears did actually happen. In April of 1864, she had been out treating patients in the countryside. She was on her way back to Lee and Gordon's Mills. She was on her own. She was stopped by a group of Confederate soldiers who saw her in her, and I just want to point out this outfit we see her in. This was her self-styled surgeon's outfit. She came up with it on her own. She made it look very military. She wanted to be associated with the United States Army. And so when she was stopped by Confederate soldiers, they were not willing to believe her story about being a doctor. They did very much think that she had been acting as a spy. And so they arrested her, and very soon she ended up at Castle Thunder in Richmond, Virginia, as a prisoner of war. And there she spent several months at Castle Thunder. The Confederates weren't quite sure what to make of her. They were unwilling to allow her to practice medicine, although she volunteered to treat fellow prisoners who were sick. She was not allowed to practice medicine. They did believe she was a spy. And it wasn't until August of 1864 that the Confederates were willing to arrange an exchange. And here we see that, you know, at perhaps some level, the United States did recognize her value to the military by allowing her to be traded for Confederate military personnel. So Mary Walker was freed in August of 1864, and rather than marking this as the end of her work with the United States military, she in fact asked for reassignment. She went back to Washington, D.C. She asked again for a military commission. She was declined, and instead she received another paid assignment, this time to go to Louisville, Kentucky, where there was a female military prison, and she was there to treat women and children who were imprisoned for being pro-Confederates. And she spent most of the rest of the war then between this establishment in Louisville, and she did then spend a little bit of time in Clarksville, Tennessee, in a similar position right at the tail end of the war. But she does finally end her employment with the United States Army at the end of the Civil War. By this point, Mary Walker had accumulated enough support within the United States military and enough political support that there was a conversation that went on in the months following the Civil War about how to best recognize Mary Walker's military service. Mary Walker still, above all, preferred a commission. She requested that it be retroactive to acknowledge her service since 1861. She did not get that. The Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, did correspond with President Andrew Johnson about this. Stanton turned the question over to the Judge Advocate General, Joseph Holt, who decided that since there was no precedent for commissioning a woman into the United States Army, that the best thing to do and the most honorable thing to do would be to award Mary Walker the Medal of Honor. And this is what President Johnson did. The award was dated November of 1865. There was much press surrounding this event. It really was a major event. And Mary Walker very proudly wore this decoration then for the rest of her life. And so far, she is still the only woman ever to receive this particular honor. And I do just want to mention that once the war was over with, Mary Walker did see that there was a very big lingering issue from the war, and that had to do with equality issues. With the emancipation of enslaved people at the end of the war, Mary Walker was very much concerned about equal rights issues and about voting rights issues. And this leads her in the years after the war to get involved with a variety of organizations promoting these causes. At the national level, there was the American Equal Rights Association, which was populated with reformers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. These were women that Mary Walker knew and interacted with quite a bit. At the more local level in Washington, D.C., Mary Walker participated in the Universal Franchise Association with women like Belva Lockwood, who would go on to become an attorney and also run for president of the United States. Universal franchise, of course, referring to equal voting rights for all adults. Mary Walker was not without her own racist beliefs. For a very brief time, and it's not entirely clear why, but for a very brief time, she tried to organize a group that would support white women getting the vote before Black men or Black women. She started talking about voting rights in very racialized terms, not that Black people should not get the vote, but that white women should come first. She organized what was called the White Women's Franchise Association. It only lasted for a few weeks, really, in 1868, before she saw that this was not a good thing, and she gave it up. And she did not talk about race very much at all then in terms of suffrage, but actually just talked about women's suffrage. But she was increasingly at odds with national suffrage figures, especially Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who thought Mary Walker was simply too outspoken. There were personality clashes. They didn't like the fact that Mary Walker still wore bloomers. They didn't like the fact that Mary Walker was so adamant about pursuing liberalized divorce laws for women. And this causes a rift between Mary Walker and virtually the rest of the suffrage movement. This starts as early as the 1870s, when Mary Walker finds herself increasingly unwelcome at the annual meetings of the National Women's Suffrage Association. And by 1898, the major National Suffrage Association, now called the National American Women's Suffrage Association, returns Mary Walker's annual dues to her, essentially telling her she's no longer welcome at any of their meetings. But she will spend the rest of her life working on behalf of the suffrage cause. And near the end of Mary Walker's life, she will die in 1919 before the 19th Amendment gets passed by Congress and then sent on to the states for ratification, but not before a board of military personnel decide in a review of the medals of honor that were awarded during the Civil War. Mary Walker was among a group of hundreds of people who had their medal rescinded in 1917. Here we see General Nelson Miles, who headed up that review board. And there's quite a bit of controversy, not only for the award itself, but then having it rescinded. Although this was supposed to be kind of an anonymous process, it's hard to believe that these men didn't know who Mary Walker was just by looking at the records of her service. And it was decided that because she was, in fact, not a commissioned member of the military, and that because she had not actually been in combat, um, that she did not in fact deserve the Medal of Honor. So she was notified that she was de-enrolled from the Medal of Honor. In true Mary Walker fashion, she simply refused to acknowledge this. She said that this review board, as far as she was concerned, had no authority to deprive her of this medal. She continued to wear the decoration until the day she died. And she simply refused to believe. She said that President Johnson had given this to her, and he was the only one. Only the president could take it away from her, not a military review board. And evidently, after decades, the military reversed itself and agreed with Mary Walker. In 1977, I think there was a confluence of forces working in Mary Walker's favor. A new women's rights movement was still at its high point by the mid to late 70s. There was a lot of activism also on behalf of the bicentennial of the United States. And for decades, Mary Walker supporters, both within her family and in the medical community, had been pushing the federal government to reevaluate this rescission. And in 1977, an Army Board for the Correction of Military Records looked at what had happened to Mary Walker's Medal of Honor in 1917 and voted to reverse that order and restored the Medal of Honor to her posthumously in 1977. So we come to the end then of Mary Walker's story. And in terms of legacy, what did her life accomplish? Well, quite a bit. Her work on behalf of suffrage helped to bring about the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920. We have that centennial observation this year, in fact, this month. Women, and I think she would be greatly pleased about this, women are now in the military in all ranks, and even the issue of serving in combat has greatly changed over the years. And we also know it is extremely common for women to be wearing pants. This does not particularly signal anything radical or unusual about a woman's life. So she did help to change quite a bit in terms of women's lives, activities, and equality in terms of gender. So quite a legacy for quite a life. And here's more of the historian in me coming out. For those of you who are interested in further readings about Mary Walker's life and times, another very good biography, besides Dr. Mary Walker's Civil War, is one that's about 10 years old from Sharon Harris called Dr. Mary Walker, an American Radical. There's also a very recent book by the historian Stephanie McCurry about women during the Civil War called Women's War. Martha Jones has a book coming out next month on Black women and the suffrage movement. And for an interesting look at the women's suffrage movement, the myth of Seneca Falls. All of these easily available, as is Dr. Mary Walker's Civil War, which you can find at all of the typical internet bookstores, from Bookshop and IndieBound to the more commercial ventures of Amazon and Barnes & Noble. One of the biggest assistances you can give to any author is to leave a review at any of these book sites that accept them. This helps to raise the profile of the book and helps more interested readers to find them. And just another quick thing, if you're interested in other wars, I do have other books that are available. I refer to this as my Philippines trilogy. These are also easily available. And if you are out there on social media, please feel free to connect with me. I'm always interested in talking about Mary Walker, about the Civil War, about women's roles. This is where you can find me online. And again, here's a photograph of the book itself, Dr. Mary Walker's Civil War. So thank you all for your time in listening to this presentation.